So we started out, on the first unit, which is events management, and in the last session we looked at, the learning outcome 1, which basically talks about the different types of events, and obviously kind of differentiates them on the basis of their size, in terms of where they happen and the classification in general. And then one of the key things that we looked at was primarily, understanding the relationship between tourism as a sector, hospitality as a service, and then events, which has become one of the key parts of the hospitality and tourism sector, and kind of brings in more revenues. So we understood the relationship and obviously definitions of these 3 different, important concepts within this particular, unit. Now, going forward, what we're going to look at is basically look at taking our journey forward into learning outcome 2. And here, the idea would be to get into a bit more detail of understanding, how does the classification of events happen from an industry perspective. So when you say you travel for tourist activity, when you say you're traveling for leisure or, business or personal reasons for holiday, vacation, whatever we call it, what we want to be able to look at is how does the industry basically classify these as events, and when you relate them to where you go in terms of, whether these are locations, destinations which are man-made, natural, it could be cultural, or a combination of all the 3 is what we will understand, in a bit more detail. And then I think once we've had a bit of an understanding of these 3 things, we are going to look at understanding, what are the benefits of staging an event. So when you hold an event, why does the tourism and hospitality industry, which is one of the largest employers in the world, has a lot of, turnover in terms of growth happening, revenue, and it has or does support a lot of other, ancillary industries, which creates employment opportunities. Why does it have a need for events or event management in general? And that is what we are going to, look at towards the end when we cover the learning outcome 2. So any questions, as always, just there and then after the session, because we've run this program before, so, what you have already on Moodle are some of the key important handouts, which will be related to learning outcome 2. And if you need anything else, obviously drop us an email and we'll make sure that that's, made available. Now, I think the only thing that will happen at some point in time later today would be that you'll have all the ebooks uploaded in all the, units. So there'll be at least one ebook that you'll get to see, which will be related to the unit, and it is one of the recommended books by, obviously the awarding organization. So let's go through some of these slides. So what we're looking at is, let's understand a classification. Now, Swarbrooke, which is one of the guys who did some research in this sector, has actually done a classification, basis 4 types. Now, he normally proposes that, you have 4 different types of, I would say, environments in which people normally go and visit. Now, that visit could be personal, business, any sort of reason, cultural reason, religious reasons. We looked at a couple in the first session, but basically classifies into 4 different types. So you have one wherein you go and visit a particular location, wherein they are not man-made, but they are naturally created environments. So when we look at things like theme parks, you look at, go to Belfast, you go to this, rock formation which has happened outside, Belfast, which is called the Giant Causeway. You go to the Great Barrier Reef, places or destinations where you will see tourism happens because it's a natural environment in which people would want to visit. So the second ones that we look at is, man-made. So when you look at, say, for example, the pyramids of Giza, you look at Egypt in particular, you look at some of the other man-made attractions, after the 9/11, the Twin Towers which have been created, you look at some of these kind of attractions which are classed into buildings, structures or sites, and they're designed for the whole purpose of attracting visitors. And in some cases, it could be for religious reasons as well. So when you look at Burma, for example, when you look at Cambodia, for example, you look at parts of India, for example, You look at the Saudi Arabia, the Holy Mecca where people go to. So these are structures which are created for religious reasons. So all these structures which are primarily man-made and are sites which attract substantial number of visitors, across the year, or for a calendar, in the calendar year, at some point of the year, they would be classed under the type. The third will be structures which are primarily created, slight differentiation between point 2 and 3. The third is that they are structures or buildings or sites created primarily for leisure, not for religious reasons. So when I look at classifying Disney, for example, Disneyland, when we look at theme parks or event parks in particular, like safari parks in particular, they are designed primarily for the purposes of attraction. They are not, they do not have any other reason, say like a religious reason or a corporate reason, for example, or a personal reason or a family reason. They are primarily designed for leisure purposes or purposes. And then we classify the fourth type into, if they do not fall into any of these three, what we do say is, okay, we look at special events, and these could be, as we look at the classification of events, like under the corporate events, you have so many. You have a press product launch, press briefing. So similarly, special events would classify or look at things like wedding anniversaries, it could be birthday parties, it could be any sort of a special event, which marks the occasion being special. Now, this type of classification, also kind of matches some of the others, which have been quite generically defined as natural features. So when you look at the first one, man-made, which is structures. Third is cultural. So things like festivals when it happens, or fairs, festivals, things like that, which are a part of the calendar year, but happen primarily because of cultural reasons. So this point is differentiated from another point that we looked at earlier, which was human man-made buildings or structures, but for leisure purposes. Here what they've done is, for cultural reasons, they've created a category. And the fourth could be a combination of any of these. So sometimes you will see people go for a holiday or a vacation, and they try and dovetail into a lot of reasons. So you could go to, for example, a country like India, you could go for holiday, you could go for visiting temples, karma, all those things would also be combined. So things like these, different classifications, but this is how, we get to see some of the classification happening when we look at, types of events, or, when we look at the classification of, sites because of which tourism originates. Now, one other classification that we look at in particular is the modern classification, which was proposed by, Leaks. And here we talk about is 4 parameters. So we talk about a regional market, we talk about a local market, we talk about national market and international market. So basically what we're trying to do is, here we want to be able to look at, let's look at, here what we want to be able to do is basically look at different types of markets, and within which the markets, what we try to do is kind of define the 3 or 4 categorizations that we look at, which is natural, or features which are because of natural environment. We look at man-made structures. Then in terms of because this classification is commercial, we, instead of looking at cultural reasons or a combination of these, what we do is classify the events on the basis of paid time. And within that, the product is going to be the center. So product means that you're going to attend an event for a family function. You could go and attend an event for a product launch. You could go and attend an event for, say, for example, a corporate dinner. You could have events which could be cultural, which could be religious, and that tends to be the product. So here, what we have in the classification is that the event is being kind of classified as a product, and because the events can be of different type, and they can be paid and free, they can be man-made, they can be natural events which you go and visit. So, for example, if you go and visit, say, the Niagara Falls in the US, what you will see is that's a natural man-made. It's not a man-made thing; it's a natural, occurrence around the lakes. And what you get to see is that is, in some cases over the years free, but obviously if you go and take a lot of tours and other things in and around that particular area, you have some options which are paid, some options which are free. Now, because events have been we have started to look at events from a point of view of generating revenue and business within this sector, hospitality and tourism, what we've done is we've split them out into whether these events could be the 4 types, but also on the basis of, whether they're happening locally, they're happening regionally. There could be a number of events which could be synchronized. One of the key things that we looked at when we had the royal wedding, what we did see is a lot of street parties. Now, this was an uncoordinated effort, but because that was a special occasion and people tend to come out and celebrate, what we did see was, though the event was happening locally in Windsor or the southeast, but we did see a regional flavor of that happening or national flavor of that happening in terms of street parties across the UK. So you did see that these events were non-commercial, but brought a lot of people together for other reasons to celebrate the royal wedding. So in this case, these were free, scale, and obviously they were pretty much street parties or celebration related to the royal wedding. So classification over the years, we tend to follow from different angles, but when street classification, we tend to kind of gone in on the commercial side. But if you look at traditional classifications, we tend to follow some of these which are classifying the types when you have these events which are because of natural features, made features, or cultural features, or a combination of these 3. Now, if I throw this into the context in terms of the ownership, when we look at the last slide, which talks about paid, free, and we talks about natural or built, or which is to do with that. We look at the ownership. Sometimes over the years, what has happened is we've seen the ownership of some of these man-made structures. They fall into public remit, they fall into voluntary organizations or charitable trusts, and some of them fall into private ownership. The reason why we differentiate this is because at some stage, some of these are used for generating revenue. So when you look at in the UK, a lot of the the royal family holdings are basically controlled by a trust, and they generate revenue. So if you're visiting Buckingham Palace, for example, or Windsor Castle, or visiting any of the other castles, say for example the Ballywood Castle in Edinburgh, you look at some of these are then in the form of charitable organizations which charge you a bit of a fee to come in and visit, and they use most of these funds to be able to maintain and upkeep some of these buildings which are natural, not natural, but national heritage buildings. So when you look at classification of museums, you look at some of the libraries, you look at some of the grade 2 or listed buildings, they have been maintained by public as voluntary organizations, and some of them are under the control of state authorities or basically in our case local authorities or councils. And because of this, what tends to happen is the upkeep, the fee that you pay to visit these locations is primarily the upkeep required to maintain them in a shape which is available for future generations. Now, when you get private ownership, that means some of these are man-made structures. So when you do this is primarily for cultural, leisure purposes. And here the partnership, in some cases, because if it's a large investment, then it could be partnerships or individuals or even private companies and consortiums. But primarily for the reasons of generating revenue, and that is why we do see that the ownership of things like, for example, Disneyland, if you look at the safari parks, or down south, when you look at Legoland, or you look at Knowsley Safari Park, lots of them in the UK, they have been created by investment coming in from the private sector. And this could be individual companies and corporations. And that's why it's important to understand that some of these destinations or locations that we look at are not available to us for free or entirely. You look at the Eden, the Eden Park, which is down south in Plymouth, which is a experiment, but over the years, there is a paid fees or some sort of a annual membership which is required to visit that, and that tends to be the case because they need to keep generating revenues to maintain its upkeep and make that available for people to come in and visit. Now, let's look briefly, in terms of what are the various attributes which these venues have. When we say that an event could be done, or when you want to stage an event, how do you pick a place? What are the key attributes or things that you look at when you pick up a particular city, place, location to do an event? Now, some of these attributes were classified by Weaver, And what we look at is when organizations, charities, companies, governments, private sector organizations, public sector organizations, when they look at creating some events, they look at certain attributes in terms of what will attract the audience, why is it going to be special, and in some cases they also would classify and relate it to the fact that how easy it is in terms of accessibility. So when you look at those attributes, you're talking about things like sometimes as an event manager going to plan an event, you look at what would be the location, and you choose a location basis the budget that you have, or in some cases the suitability of the location, because you want to get the maximum crowds or maximum participation from audience. So in those cases, ownership and orientation becomes important, because if you look at a venue which is like a public park, or a location which could be easily rented out from the council by getting permissions, but does not have that much of rental or some sort of fees attached to it, you will go in for some of those venues in locations when you are hosting or staging an event which is to do with, say, fairs or some sort of outdoor events. But if you're looking at hosting a premium event, it could be, say, a gala dinner, or something to do with a charity event, and you want people to come in, and so in those cases you look at picking up a venue which is quite posh and obviously central, maybe a 5-star hotel, and that is where you'll start to look at parameters or attributes like what could be the orientation of that venue. Is it considered upmarket? Is it considered posh? Is it considered, for example, something where people will come in and frequent and want to visit, or is it something which is likable? So those attributes is what we consider when we look at some of these which are listed on the slide. So sometimes you look at configuration, the spatial configuration, because if you're hosting, for example, a drama or a stage show, then you need some sort of a theater style seating. If you're hosting a dinner, you need a round table or some sort of a seating. So sometimes these attributes, like you look at status, you look at carrying capacity, that means how many people can you include if you're doing an exclusive event, say for example a premiere of a film, or you're looking at a premiere of say an art gallery or a painting. So you have to look at capacity, how many people can come in because of health and safety, because of in terms of visits which are going to be happening to the venue, how much audience can it actually carry at any given point in time in that location. And I mentioned things like accessibility, market, and context. Now you wouldn't want to hold, say for example, a stage event in an open ground or in an open location, because that would mean that the event might not carry that much of relevance if you're doing that. But you might have to choose a opera house or a related kind of a thing, wherein that would make sense for you to do. So you have to look at these attributes, because if these attributes are carefully chosen and you do not relate it to the type of event that you're doing, then it becomes very difficult to generate the end output which is required when you're holding that event. Now, in most cases, events are related to some sort of revenue. They're related to some sort of, cultural value or strategic value in terms of, uplifting the profile of the, location, or maybe the artist in those cases. So you have to choose a location which is primarily giving you the most optimum return on investment, and some of them needs to be looked at, by matching to these attributes. Now, sometimes you look at, when we talked about, these are slides just giving you some examples of, non-purpose built attractions. Now, look at a lot of man-made and natural attractions, but let's look at understanding some of them from a point and relate to that. So some of these were created, over the years for different reasons, but have now become attractions, like when you look at the churches like Notre Dame, when you look at it in Paris, look at some of the shopping malls, for example, in London, if you look at the Westlife, we look at Manchester, the Trafford, some of these have become, but actually created for different reasons, but over the years become attractions or a must-see attraction when people actually visit some of these locations. Now, factories, if you see, a lot of people have interest in understanding how manufacturing happens. So when you go to the US, probably people try and visit the Harley-Davidson factory. So some of the iconic things, when you go to many people try and visit the Mercedes-Benz or the BMW, the museum or the factory. So these have become attractions over the years, which were actually not created for that purpose. But yes, because of the changing preferences, and they have become landmark kind of attractions in that location. So if you come, it's a must see when it comes to visiting that location. Now, some of the attractions over the years have been declared something called a World Heritage Site. Now, these are attractions or tourist destinations, or maybe within a destination, a particular location, which have now been identified by United Nations or UNESCO as attractions which are of importance in terms of cultural heritage, in terms of natural heritage, in terms of history, essentially. So when you look at the attractions in Egypt, for example, when you look at Stonehenge in the UK, they have been declared as World Heritage Sites because these are things which were created a number of years back or thousands of years back, and they have now relevance in the history books, and it's our duty to maintain them and have them available for future generations. So sometimes you will see, if you go to certain locations, there will be a strict rule in terms of you say when you use those or go and visit those places, there'll be strict things in terms of no liquids, no plastics, or you cannot harm the environment and things like that, because they have been declared as heritage sites by UN or UNESCO, and in this case they are considered a part of history and are important from a point of view of our cultural heritage or the natural heritage in some locations. So if you look at the Amazon forest, for example, there are certain areas in the Amazon forest which have been declared as World Heritage Sites because they have a lot of the tribes within the Amazon forest, and they are the last few tribes remaining in that region. And that is why if people have to visit, they have to understand the nuances of treating that site as a World Heritage Site, and they have to observe certain rules so that the natural environment is preserved, and yet they do not kind of infringe into the environment that they're going in for visit or for tourism. So when you look at Burma in particular, when you look at some places in Sri Lanka, when you look at some places primarily in the Middle East, they have been declared World Heritage Sites because they are a part of our history. They show a lot of lineage in terms of background of how the culture and our modern generations actually originated, and that is why some of these sites actually need to be observed. And there the classification comes across wherein you say, okay, these are natural sites or these are man-made sites, but over the years they become World Heritage Site because they are a part and parcel of our history. So when you look at some of the Nazi camps in Austria, wherein a lot of Holocaust and religious things happen, some of them have been preserved as World Heritage Sites because they're a part of history, and a lot of people actually go in and visit those sites to understand the reasons of why this happened, and sometimes they go in and want to see these things from a point of view of history, and that is where the relevance of these actually comes in. Now, we discussed in the first learning outcome, this is a full learning outcome that we will do, but again, as a part and parcel of how to classify events on the basis of attraction, MICE is important because a lot of events which happen across the globe, some of the mega cities that we talk about, like London, New York, Paris, you talk about cities like Singapore, these cities primarily host a lot of these events, and these events then in turn drive tourism to that location. So MICE is an important factor, and we'll study that in the next learning outcome. We also classify events on the basis of their types. So sometimes you see the sporting events like the Wimbledon, which has started recently now. You look at the Olympics and the Football World Cup, which is happening, the FIFA World Cup. These are events which are classified on the basis of their types. So sometimes you will have that classification wherein it should drive tourism for a certain number of days or a period of time, and that is why this classification is important. Mega events, we did look at some of them briefly, things like the Olympics, the FIFA World Cup, which is happening, and these are mega events because they generate a lot of interest, and a lot of visitors tend to come in and generate tourism for that location. the events are happening. Now, sometimes when you look at hosting events, there are bits and pieces of events that we have to look at wherein language tends to be a barrier or the culture tends to be a barrier, but that does not mean that people should be prohibited or should feel the need that that is a destination or a location where they can't go in and experience culture or history. So in some cases, you have the role of visitor centers, and these visitor centers, they play a very dominant role when we look at events in general. So you have tourist information which is available from them, but also what they tend to do is they have a large event which is happening, like the events which happen in the O2 Arena, or here in Manchester, the O2 Arena again. What we do get to see is that sometimes when a big event or a gig or a music festival is happening, there are signposts and other things created, temporary parking lots being created, and this is to facilitate and ease the whole aspect of hosting the event in that location. Sometimes you take bus tours and things like that, you will see that because there are lots of different types of visitors which come to London, you will see that the bus tours typically have some sort of, a language, they have commentary available when you're on the bus tour. They are available in different languages, I think about 15 odd languages. So over the years, what has happened is, in order to facilitate interaction with visitors coming to a location, the industry has in general created the concept of something called tourist centers or information centers, and in some cases they end up facilitating or providing information which helps run some of these events in those venues time and again, because of the periodicity that we look at. The events happening time and again over the years, and they become a part of the calendar, cultural calendar for that particular location. They tend to then look at putting in some investment which allows for the information center to make information available in different forms when some of these events are actually happening in those locations. Is that okay? So this gives you a bit of a generically what we've done is we've covered some of the key aspects of Learning Outcome 2. And now the subsequent slides, what I've done is I've put together some of the key details which are into the tasks. So the task 2.1 talks about, looking at evaluating the characteristics of various real life events within the, THM sector. So here, when we talk about the real life events, we're talking about events like the royal wedding, which happened, a couple of weeks back. We talked about, in this case, this event actually was, obviously a man-made event. It basically falls into a category wherein the event happened live, and then we had a lot of celebration of these events in terms of parties across the UK. And because this event was, let's look at some of the aspects of why this was a real life event. So we know, okay, they were getting married, the royal couple was getting married, but why was it real life? Because I think when I broaden my, thinking and I look at things like this event was being broadcasted live, and there was an audience of say 1.3 billion viewers across the world. This event, because it was filmed and broadcasted live, had a lot of people indirectly participate from a point of view of television viewing across the globe. And this event people related to having a lot of street parties in the UK because they wanted to celebrate this occasion. So all the characteristics that we talk about of things like why this was a real life, a lot of press coverage, broadcasting, street parties, people's involvement, considering that it was event which happens, say, in a lifetime, or I think we saw the royal wedding after a number of years of Catherine and Prince William actually getting married. So these events tend to happen. They're already talking about the next royal wedding, which will happen probably in the next 20, 25 years, or which will be for the kids of Prince and Meghan, and Prince Harry and Meghan and things like that. So these events classification of being real life events. Now here, if we have to dwell into these events a bit more, what we want to be able to understand is who are the key stakeholders of the event, right? So the key stakeholders of the event were the royal family. We had the people in and around the royal family, so it could be the family of Princess Meghan Markle. We look at some of the family of Prince Harry, and they, along with maybe the state, they along with the royal, the monarchy in particular, or the royal family in particular, were the key stakeholders. When we look at the select invitation to the guests, they were also stakeholders because they were invited to attend the wedding. And then the other stakeholders which were participants in the events, things which wherein we look at some of the people which were part and parcel of the event from a point of view of preparations. When we look at the bands, we look at the participation of the the army, and all those things. We look at those being stakeholders because they were a part of being the organizers to be able to run this event, in a fixed fashion. So sometimes when you look at classification of these events, we need to understand what are the characteristics of real life events. So there are some characteristics which have come to. So it involved things like the media, and media could be television, press, whatever. We look at a lot of people who get involved in the operational side of things, and they will be cast as co-workers. And then you have the participants. In some cases, these are different from the participants who are actually involved in the whole event themselves, which is the royal wedding. Participants, which are performers, musicians, keynote speakers, the family, and the paraphernalia. So, for example, if I say the guest list and all the caterers and everything, they tend to be the participants because they also play a very individual role as far as that is concerned. Now, one of the key elements of a real life is the audience or the spectators. So if I say an example of a gig or a music concert that we are seeing, you see the organizers which organize the event. The key person in the event would be the person who is actually coming in to perform. And apart from that, the performance is going to be witnessed by a lot of audience and fans. And they, in some cases, would be spectators if they're not directly participating. But if they are a part and parcel of that event and are participating actively, they'll be called the audience because there's a bit of interaction between the person on the stage and the audience. So they tend to be, termed as audience. Now, spectators would be people who are actually watching from home or, watching from outside the stadium or the location, and they tend to be the key stakeholder when a real life event actually tends to happen.
Okay.
So if you relate to and pick up an example of a real life event which is happening, sometimes you get to see the London Marathon, which is happening. Now that's a real-time event, real life event, because once a year, 35,000 people come together and there's a London Marathon which happens. You have people who are spectators, there's press which is there, there's media coverage, it's also covered live, and then you have, a whole lot of participants which are actually facilitating the staging of the London Marathon, which could include security, charity companies, organizations which look at, A&E and a lot of other things, which basically medical, people which are standby. So all that tends to be something called a real life event. Is that okay? So here in this task, what you'll have to do is pick up a real life event and then talk about the stakeholders. And in some cases, after talking about the stakeholders, you'll have to talk about what is their individual role and why is it a real life event, and that would tend to cover the task 2.1 in terms of evaluation. Okay. Now, if I go to task 2.2, here it talks about classify the range of venues within the THM sector which are suitable for staging of events. So you're going to be talking about the types of, or basically the topology of or types of the classification of the venues, and these will then, you'll have to give it a bit of a table or an example to say why the classification actually looks at that. So we start off with the industry classification, which talks about the types of events. It could be 4 types. And then when you talk about these 4 types, you can further detail that down into one of the types of events, and then choose the suitable venues why these events happen in that location. And say, for example, when I talk about a range of events would be these kind, but then what the task would ask you to focus on is range of venues. So here, if I choose, for example, a corporate event could be held at different types of venues depending on the type of corporate event. So if it's a PR launch or a product launch, if it's a corporate dinner, if it's a charity dinner, if maybe it's an annual meeting. In these cases, these are all corporate events, but the location at which these events are done could be different. So when you have an annual general meeting or an AGM, this will typically happen in a large location because you might have, it's a big company, maybe 1,000, 1,500 people attending or shareholders attending, and that's why it normally tends to happen in a larger location. You might end up choosing a boardroom or a meeting room which has a large capacity of, say, 500, 600, whatever it is, depending on the audience. But if it's a corporate dinner, you might end up having it in a 5-star hotel or in a specific resort, or in an exclusive place wherein only guests by invitation are invited. Here, the idea would be to pick up a type of event and then table classify, or maybe in a tabular fashion, list out the range of venues which could be suitable to do these kind of events. Now, sometimes you look at family events. I would pick up that category of family events. Within the family events, you could have different types. You could have birthday parties, you could have weddings, you could have kiddie parties, you could have, wedding showers or anniversary parties, things like that. And when you look at that, you then classify in the table the individual venues of why they are suitable for those events. So, for example, if you're having a birthday party, it could be a location which could be an outdoor location, or you might have an activity-led location which could be wherein you're having it, wherein you invited a lot of friends and kids, and there are a number of activities that you're doing. It could be at home as well if it's a small gathering, depending on so the classification of venues is required when you list out a particular type of event. Is that okay? We'll look at a bit of understanding in terms of what is the impact of globalization on events. How is, in general, the connected world having an effect on the events industry in general. So here the idea would be that when you look at over the years, if you look at last 20 years, or if you look at the last 30 years, maybe in the last 30 years air travel was available, but a lot of people could not afford to travel. But as the economic status of people has risen, as the disposable income has risen, the air travel has become cheap. So if you look at Ryanair, EasyJet, these airlines were practically non-existent before 2004, 2005. But these airlines, when they came in, the impact has been that it has made travel quite affordable. And because of the advances in telecommunication, when you look at the early 2000s or early 90s, you had a mobile phone, and 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 people had mobile phones, depending on the country we pick and choose. But in the early 2000s, it started to become a commodity, and now you look at, about what 2 billion smartphones are sold every year. So if the world population is 8 billion, you have approximately 1/4 of that being sold every year. So the impact of globalization has to be understood from a point of view of, other industries around tourism, which could be travel, which could be hotel, which could be telecommunication. It could be in general, understanding how some of the locations or destinations wherein millions and billions of dollars are being invested. So when you look at locations like Macau, Las Vegas, you look at some of these bigger cities, which are cities within cities, and they've been created primarily because they want to attract tourism or people coming in, for a number of days, and that has a lot of spend which happens around, that location to generate tourism, and that kind of tends to drive the local economy, or even provides income and livelihood to people in that location. So that means and the importance of that location has also started to generate tourism. When you look at interior parts of China, when you look at interior parts of India, for example, you look at interior parts of Egypt, for example, there you see that some of these places were already frequented by tourists, but as the knowledge and awareness of some of these locations and venues became available, these locations also then benefited from the impact of globalization, because travel became easier, telecommunication and the reach became easier, and that is why these locations are now kind of on the world radar for tourism activities, and there is where some of the events and related activities are also happening. So when you look at the safari, the night safari in say Dubai or Abu Dhabi, when you look at these were events which used to happen but at a smaller scale. But over the years, what has happened is the impact of globalization has meant that a lot of people now want to experience, have the ability to be able to spend because of economic reasons, and want to look at these events or experience the events firsthand. And that is where the impact is actually being seen, which tends to benefit the events industry in general. Now, the last aspect that we want to look at is some of this is also looking at promoting the concept of sustainability. As tourism increases, what you do get to see is we get to hear plastics in ocean, for example. Now, that's not a direct example, but in some places, when you look at which is primarily tourism is only driving the economy, you will see that conservation and sustainability is becoming a key element when it comes to modes of transport, the venue itself, and when you look at some of the other facilities which facilitate tourism in that region. So when you look at Bali, Indonesia, for example, you look at Maldives, you look at destinations like Ibiza, or you look at destinations like Mallorca, wherein a lot of this is driven primarily by tourism. What is happening is in those locations, the concept of sustainability, preservation of environment, those kind of things are now becoming important. So reuse, recycling, and obviously looking at less and less wastage in terms of resources is being kind of let me put it, as being aggressively promoted, because what they want to be able to do is promote the environment conservation in that location, so that it is available to a number of people across or for a number of years, if this is taken as a concept going forward. So in some places, when you look at, when you go to some mega cities, you will see, like when you go to Amsterdam, more or less you see that the cars are banned in the city center, or you can't drive cars in certain locations, because what they want to do is promote the concept of environment free of pollution. And this is where they kind of promote the concept of bikes or cycles. You look at Barcelona, for example, you look at London now, in some places, you have these facilities where you can, rather than using public transport, your private transport, you either use public transport or use other methods of transport, which kind of encourage, sustainability or, preservation of environment. Is that okay? Right. Last is basically the learning outcome 2.3, and that talks about, explaining the benefits of, staging events in the THM sector. Part of it is something which is this is quite straightforward. It's very easy to understand. Is why do you think events as a has come up as a separate let's say a separate vertical within the THM sector, tourism and hospitality sector? This is because in order to drive revenues, quicker revenues in volumes, what you do get to see is that a lot of destinations which rely on tourism over the years have come up with the concept of creating an event which creates a spike in tourism, or during certain months, or in certain months when there is no tourism. So these events actually tend to promote that location to bring in the money to the local economy. But apart from that, let's look at some of the other reasons why events are hosted. So you see the Cultural City of the Year, which is a competition started off in the EU, and the idea here is they're looking at raising the profile of the city. Like Liverpool, Hull, for example, is the Cultural City of the Year this year. When you look at these kind of events, the idea is there they want to raise the profile of the city, and that is why some of these events are important. And here, this staging of event is done by public-private partnership. That means there's a keen involvement by the local government, regional government, national governments, and also you will get to see that the private sector tends to participate, because there are long-term benefits of staging this kind of an event, wherein the Cultural City of the Year would be something which will be celebrated across the year, and that will bring in a lot of tourists and money into the local economy. You will see that regeneration projects, which government actually invests in, they are primarily long-term investment projects, because they do see say for example, now this is the talk about the third runway at Heathrow. What is this? This is, now they are not staging an event, but in a way, if you there is capacity to bring in more traffic. And what they do see is after Brexit, London is going to be one of the important hubs for flights connecting to transatlantic flights and things like that. And they do see that if we create a third runway now, in terms of long-term investment from a government point of view, this will tend to then bring in a lot of traffic or people to the city of London, and that would mean money for the economy, tourism and things like that. But if I look at staging an event, they might not be staging an event, but the construction of the airport itself or the third runway would be any kind of an event from a public infrastructure point of view and raising the profile of London as a city, making it much more accessible. And this point, which is jobs and investment, easy to understand that, when you do the short-term events, when you have football matches and, things like that, there is a lot of short-term employment which gets generated because you will need security, you will need volunteers, and all of that tend to, kind of facilitate the happening of that event in that location. Now, sometimes you look at benefits which are short-term benefits. So when you look at Olympics as an event, this is a long-term investment because the bidding for the Olympics in the city actually happens 8 to 10 years in advance. A lot of investment goes into the construction of infrastructure, but it tends to bring in short-term benefits because the whole the Olympics tend to happen within 30 to 40 days, Olympic and Paralympics. So you see 22 days and 18 days, probably about 40 days, but it tends to bring in a lot of, tourism to the city. The royal wedding. Now that's a short-term event, but there's a lot of planning which has happened in the background for that event to happen, and probably a year before it actually, or 6 to 8 months before actually it was kind of, conceived. The planning of that event actually started to happen. But the short-term benefit of that was the next day, if you remember, the headlines in the newspapers were that 1.3 billion viewers, and that brings in initial boost of £1 billion to the local economy, because people went out, spent, did local parties or gatherings, and that tended to drive up the sales of certain types of products, which meant short-term economic benefits. You look at FIFA football happening, and you see that it's already being talked about in the news that the CO2 is in short supplies, the things, and the beer, for example, in terms of the sale of beer actually tends to increase because of this particular event. So you look at staging of events, and sometimes you will see that companies and organizers will actually do an outreach to various different types of people and industries, because they see that they are also indirectly going to benefit. Now, if you have an event being hosted, like let's look at meeting and conference, you'll see that what they will tend to do is they will tend to do tie-ups with hotels, the cab industry. They will tend to do tie-ups with restaurants in that area, any possible sector which they see will benefit from that event. And what they tend to do is, in order to drive revenues, they will say, okay, we have done corporate types with these locations. You're traveling and you're booking a flight, you can book a hotel at a discounted rate. But what has happened in the background is that the businesses are tied up in such a way that it generates a cascading set of business from one leading to the other. So if you're coming to attend that meeting or conference, you'll book a flight, you'll evidently need to book a hotel. When you book a hotel, you need a cab service or a ride which will pick you up from the airport. And when you are there for a number of days, you're going to be wine dining, and then you're going across to a different number of restaurants, and that tends to be a fuller package when you look at the benefits of staging the event, because it does not just involve one industry, but the main organizer of that event tends to tie up with other industries to see what could be the financial benefits which they could get, even if it's short term, but returns on investment, because they will say, okay, we'll make Uber the exclusive cab riding service during that event. Now that would mean Uber plastered across a lot of locations, Uber logo being used, and that would be, in general, they will ask Uber to do a bit of sponsorship, and that would mean bring in money to the organizers for choosing Uber as a preferred service over Lyft or any other service. Correct? Now, disadvantages as well, and when we talk about these disadvantages, sometimes you'll see I mentioned some of these in the past, and the idea is because you're explaining the benefits, so we're looking at both the positives and the negatives. And the negatives could be things like the cost of buildings. Sometimes these infrastructure projects, they cost a lot, but the return on investment is very long term. That means 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. You look at they are and the money being spent, proportionate amount of money being spent is only short term, but the returns on that might also be short term, but the investment gets locked in for a number of years. Sometimes you will see negative publicity of the event is because the events attract a different kind of press, and that would mean a negative publicity. Could you think of an event which involves negative publicity? If you talk about something which is negative publicity. I think it tends to be, I think in some cases what will happen is when you look at, some of these G7, conferences which happen, the political, meetings which tend to happen sometimes, they generate a lot of negative publicity because like the climate talks were happening, the Greenpeace wasn't happy. So you tend to see that there's a bit of negative PR or press around that event because people are not happy about it, or they are saying the agenda, the real agenda is not addressed. And, you get to see people protesting and, negative press happening because of that. So sometimes you will see some of them tend to happen because, they tend to be events which are in general not discussing issues which are key to the whole, conference or that meeting. So you will also see that, some of the major disadvantages of happening, some of the sporting events, which I've kind of, put as a headline, would be that sometimes you will see the cost of security. G4, for example, was handed out a contract of worth 260 million when London Olympics happened. So that was a cost in itself to maintain security for the event, and which meant that the ticket prices, went up because the security at that point in time was a heightened issue, and it had to be dealt with, and it had a knock-on effect on the prices of tickets up when people were looking at buying tickets for venues, or for example, for some of the events happening in those venues during that point in time. But in general, what we talk about is sometimes when you host an event, you have to look at some of these things which are advantageous and some of the things which are not that advantageous or negative and could relate or generate, negative publicity in general happening for the event. Is that okay? This is something we will cover, which is the next, learning outcome 3, and we're going to be talking about, MICE in a great more detail, because this learning outcome is going to be, the next one is going to be all about, meetings and conventions and exhibition, and why this has become within the events as a vertical, why this has become the most important revenue driver, within events management. Any questions on this, Selina, so far? I'm not able to hear you that well, to be honest. It's a bit distorted.